All right, so last time we left off with attitude. So A, something and other. At first, they are indifferent to one another. And other is also an immediate existence. A something, the negation thus falls outside both. Something is in itself in contrast to its being for other, but the determinants belongs also to its in itself. And B, the determination of this in itself in turn passes over into constitution, and this latter, as identical determination, constitutes the immanent and at the same being for another, the limit of something which, C, is the immanent determination of the something itself, and the something thus is the finite. In the first division, where existence in general was considered, this existence had, as at first taken up, the determination of an existent. The moments of its development, quality and something, are therefore of equally affirmative determination. The present division, on the contrary, develops the negative determination, which is present in existence and was there from the start only as negation in general. It was then the first negation, but has now been determined to the point of the being in itself of the something, the point of the negation of negation. And just another pointer. And, I hope this gets burned in your brains. So, this is existence, which equals quality, which equals first reality, which is beside negation, which also equals other stuff. Perhaps I should color that differently, I don't know. And then when these come together in something, what do you know? Existence. God, my circles are awful, I'm sorry. Existence, obviously you can tell this doubled structure. This structure is now doubled within itself. So if you look at it in the terms of the mutual non-being, how this thing on the right and this thing on the left are not each other, and you look at how the things within them are not each other, what do you know? The whole thing is in the shape of negation, and negation is inside negation, which leaves you with the negation of negation. So negation as a totality versus negation as a moment of the totality. It works on so many levels, and it's great. At least I think it's great. I don't know about y'all. Anyways, yeah, I said negation. The negation is pretty great, but I think that the real value of it is entirely in revealing self-relationship to be of interest, particularly in the way that negativity or negations, negative forms, are meaningful in a self-relative way, in a way that positive forms are not. You say being is, and you don't notice any trouble with that. It doesn't bring to mind anything new. Even though, if you actually stop and think about it, it's kind of weird. You're making a negative relationship between the positive and the positive through itself, making a practical distinction between what it is, how it is, in order to understand that it is. But with negatives, it kind of just strikes at you immediately. A negative or negative, you're like, okay, what is it? Positive. What is a positive or positive? You don't think about the negative. It doesn't work backwards that way. So I think the importance of negation is particularly just something that points out that self-relationship which things have to themselves, even in the positive form. The trouble is that in the positive form, you have to do some you have to go into it in a sort of analysis mode. Whereas with the negative, it just jumps out at you immediately. The other is something. Something doesn't strike you as being the other. But with the negatives, it always jumps out at you. So something and other. 1. Something and other are first both existence or something. Second, all right, sorry about that. Let me restart. So something and other are first both existence or something. Second, each is equally an other. It is indifferent which is named first, and just for this reason it is named something. In Latin, when they occur in a proposition, both are aliud, or the one, the other. Alius, alium. In the case of an alternating relation, the analogous expression is alter, alterum. If of two beings we call the one A and the other B, the B is the one which is first determined as other, but the A is just as much the other of the B. Both are other in the same way. This serves to fix the distinction in the something which is to be taken in the affirmative sense. But this also expresses the fact that the distinction and the privileging of one something is a subjective designation that falls outside the something itself. The whole determinateness falls on the side of this external pointing. Also, the expression this contains no distinctions. Each and every something is just as good a this as any other. By this, we mean to express something completely determinate, overlooking the fact that language, as a work of the understanding, only expresses the universal, albeit naming it as a single object. But an individual name is something meaningless in the sense that it does not express a universal. It appears as something merely posited and arbitrary for the same reason that proper names can also be arbitrarily picked, arbitrarily given, as well as arbitrarily altered. So, one thing I think to be noted here is this starts with an external reflection. We start by comparing something and other without having explained how the hell we're getting these out of each other, which I don't like. I don't like that he did this. It's like the way that he begins with being and nothing. If you remember, he tells us, well, if you compare them, they're the same. They're the same contentless, empty indeterminacy. And you're not supposed to do that with this method. What you're supposed to do is develop it out of the things themselves. But here, he just kind of has. We get this formalism. Okay, we got the other. Hey, guess what? We got the something. Something it exists. Therefore, there's got to be another right next to it. So, boom, we have two things, and now we're going to talk about them in comparison and say, look, we can't differentiate. It's exactly like being in nothing, where the form and the content is just bouncing back and forth, and is really indeterminately the same. Or rather, in this case, it's determinately indeterminate. But that's just an external reflection. It's a comparison.
One moment.
Okay, the other which is such for itself is the other within it, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. Therefore, the absolutely unequal in itself, that which negates itself, alters itself. No, let me switch. I love this paragraph. This paragraph is pure, unadulterated Hegel. The other which is such for itself is the other within it. Hence, the other of itself, and so the other of the other. Therefore, the absolutely unequal in itself, that which negates itself, alters itself. But it equally remains identical with itself, so that into which it alters is the other, and this other has no additional determination, but that which alters itself is not determined in any other way than in this, to be an other. In going over to this other, it only unites with itself. It is thus posited as reflected into itself a sublation of the otherness, a self-identical something, from which the otherness, which is at the same time a moment of it, is therefore distinct, itself not appertaining to it as something. This is 100% language games. The way to get this is literally the way it reads. It is a self-referential meaning game. So, reading it again. The other which is such for itself is the other within it, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. So, since otherness is not referring to something, but rather refers to itself, and the otherness is, of course, as we already said, reality, negation, and just like negation, it is the negative form. So it is the mutual non-being, or the non-being of the unity. It's the difference, one may say. So this other, or otherness, has one, otherness within it, and two, if one thinks about it as a specific determinate otherness, it also is an otherness to another otherness. But in so doing, what do you know? It's just like something. What happens? The structure has repeated. If otherness is other to an otherness, it is otherness. So if otherness is other to otherness, it is otherness. But this is a contradiction, because if otherness was other to otherness, it would be other to otherness, which is not otherness. The other to otherness is something. So if the other is other, it is other only to otherness. If otherness is other to other, another thing is only other to itself. But if it is other to itself, then it is not itself. If it's true, it's false. But if otherness is not other to otherness, then it still isn't otherness. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's false. Which is another way in which it becomes a true. So other, if it is, then it is something. If it's not, then it's also something, because then it's not the other. Either way, otherness falls into something. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is what I think is one of the clearest total dialectics in the whole logic. If this doesn't make sense, God help us. So, if it succeeds in being other, then it's not other, because it remains within itself. Well, if it succeeds in being other, it's the other of the other, therefore it no longer remains within itself. If it fails to be other, then it has failed to be other. It's the other of the other then, because it's not the other, and therefore it's something anyways. Either way, the other cannot remain within itself. He says here, it is the absolutely unequal in itself, that which negates itself, alters itself. And this is internal to the other. It's not something that happens between otherness and something. It's something that happens strictly within otherness itself. The otherness to otherness is nonetheless in the shape of otherness, and therefore what we have is internal to otherness itself. It's not some outside, it's not some distinct substance or entity. It is all within itself. So, you may want to grasp this as either in the meaning sense of just the other of the other, or you may want to look at it in the form of images and diagrams I'm drawing out for you, those kinds of things. Either way, it works out the same. That insofar as the otherness remains other within its own otherness, that is, he says, it is thus posited as reflected into itself with sublation of the otherness, a self-identical something, because self-identity, which, yes, it is an external reflection, but it's impossible. Even Hegel does it. You can't really talk about all this stuff in a very determinate way without using these categories that are not yet justified. And we have a proper intuitive sense of them. We just haven't justified them fully. So you can get away with doing it, but technically you shouldn't do it. So 2. The something preserved itself in its non-being. It is essentially one with it and essentially not one with it. It therefore stands in reference to an otherness without being just this otherness. The otherness is at once contained in it and yet separated from it. It is being for other. All right, before we jump to that, I want to show something, because Hegel doesn't show it. He sort of does, but he sort of doesn't. So we had something which we acquired with reality and negation as a unity. Something is their immediate totality, the unity of that total process. And then the way we got something is, well, something is, therefore exists. Therefore, it has the other beside it. And boom, that's how we get the other. One thing you can look at is what I've been pointing out before with reality and negation, that you might want to see this as one, if something is the unity, which is the purple circle, then the other would be the distinction, the non-being of that unity. And you could see it either within something, or you could see it in this relationship outside or beside something as this totality. Because this is also one way that it moves. You can either look at the totality which it is and how it's distinguished within itself, or you can look at it and say, well, if something is, it is only insofar as it exists. This existence is a negation. Therefore, something isn't really this thing that's subsists in and of itself within itself, but rather it is this distinction, this negation between mutual non-beings, and that is what otherness is. So that is how you move from something and other and back again. And just wanted to bring that up because Hegel doesn't explain how we really get from something back to the other. We know very easily how we get the something out of the other, but it's not so clear how the something gets us to the other in the first place. It seems like an external reflection, but there is an immanence to it. Make sense? Anybody got issues with that? Makes sense? Yes, no, move on?
I'm good to move on.
All right, just want to make sure people... All right, let's move on. So the something preserves itself in its non-being. It is essentially one with it and essentially not one with it. It therefore stands in reference to an otherness without being just this otherness. The otherness is at once contained in it and yet separated from it. It is being for other. Okay, so that one's, I think, pretty simple, and it gets increasingly easier to diagram these as we get more and more concrete. So we have the something, and here we have the other as standing on its own. We have the something as standing on its own. And the black shall be the color of negation. The meaning of being for other is precisely a consideration of, we may want to call this the negation, this mutual non-being, or we may just call it the otherness. After all, it is being for other. Something and other are what they are insofar as they are other. Through their mutual otherness, they are. And this is specifically, one, well, it's quite literally there, right? It's called being for other. It's being through otherness. It's something through otherness. That's what being for other is.
Could we say that it's mediated through otherness?
Yeah, you could say that. Because you can recur the concepts. And this is one way to understand it. You just saw, with becoming, coming to be and ceasing to be is just being and nothing run through becoming. Being for other and then being in itself is something and other run through each other. So you could see it that way, and it does work. Where was I? Being for other. Existence as such is an immediate, bare references, or it is in the determination of being. However, as including non-being within itself, existence is determinate being negated within itself, and then in the first instance an other. But since in being negated it preserves itself at the same time, it is only being for other. Just a further explanation. It preserves itself in its non-being and is being, not however being in general, but being with reference to itself in contrast to its reference to the other, as self-equality in contrast to its inequality. Such a being is being in itself. So one way to put this is going back to the other. The other is the other of the other, which in being other is other. What do we have that? We have otherness within otherness. Otherness, therefore, references itself. The self-reference stuff is very important. References itself as other, is within itself, and therefore that's why it is being in itself or something. I could leave that up if any of you find that interesting. The other way so that's one way to make sense of that, by looking at what we've already done. And if the other makes sense to you, if that self-reference makes sense to you, if you can see the structure of itself within itself, being in itself is completely clear. The other sense is that if being for other is this mutual non-being, and being for other is, therefore exists, there is another being for other, which obviously has to be in opposition to it, be posited beside it, and what do you know? It's in the exact same form. Being for other is now in being for otherness, but being for other is precisely that which is not within itself, but here it is within itself. So what does being for other as being for other end up being? It is being in itself. Does that make sense? It's literally the same logic as the something and other, just repeating at different layers now, where the other is something. The being for other of being for other is, guess what? Being in itself. So you can see that as a structural dynamic, repeating.
Being for other and being in itself are just the two movements that occur with something and other, just considered on either side of the emphasis.
Yeah, that's one way to see it. There's multiple layers here going on, and if you start looking at this all the way back from the beginning of the logic and how those concepts are recurring, it gets crazy so fast, and it all makes sense. You can put this in so many different angles with a proper and true meaning. It just shows you different angles of it. There's also the sense in which, remember how becoming becomes, and like this isn't just like some structural little quirk of like, oh, okay, I can see this pattern, right? There's also a sense or meaning distinction that if something is being for other, there has to be a being that is there to be other to in the first place. But in order to have being for other, there has to be a being in itself to which a being in itself is other to. Therefore, being for other is it's the proper thing, isn't it? Well, it's revealed here. The proper way to say it is that what is revealed here is that in order to be for other, just so that you can be for other, you could call it, the condition for the possibility. Just the condition for the possibility of being for other is being in itself. Because if there wasn't any independent being in itself, what the hell would it mean to be other to it? What would there be? There would be nothing to be other to. So on that meaning sense level, this works as well. And really the most important level is that meaning sense level, like it is, because all of the logic is operative on meaning. Pure sense meaning, not in the senses, but in sense as the meaning, the intelligibility of things. That level is the most important, to understand just the seeming linguistic games of, the other, that, if something is, it exists, therefore it is distinguished, it has an other beside it. And then, something isn't this thing that really is just in itself. It is other to another, and therefore it's otherness. And you get a drawing out of distinctions just by thinking through that meaning. Like, what would it even mean to be? That's to me the proper way to grasp any and all of anything Hegel does. So being in itself, being for other and being in itself constitutes the two moments of something. They are here two pairs of determinations. One, something and other. Two, being for other and being in itself. The former contain the non-connectedness of their determinateness. Something and other fall apart. But their truth is their connection. Being for other and being in itself are therefore the same determinations posited as moments of one and the same unity, as determinations which are connections and in which their unity remain in the unity of existence. Each thus itself contains within it at the same time and also the moment diverse from it. And this thing, he says, these are two moments, the two moments of something. I mentioned it before that you can look everything that goes in the logic either as going inwards or building upward. You can view all of this as, we're digging into the grounds of being or the grounds of intelligibility, the conditional grounds, the condition for the possibility of whatever, or whatever being is, or we're constructing it. That you can see this as either we're going inwards to meaning or we're going upwards. It doesn't matter. It makes completely intelligible sense to me, regardless of whether you think of these as within something or as themselves containing something. It works the same way. Unless I'm ever shown otherwise, but I haven't seen any reason to think it makes any difference. And everything Hegel says seems to point to me that it indeed makes no difference. Hegel says, it makes no difference what order you're going from. You can start from the absolute idea and go backwards to being. It doesn't matter. Just as you can go from being all the way to absolute idea. The only issue is just pragmatic. Being and nothing in their unity, which is existence, are no longer being and nothing. They are only outside their unity. So in their restless unity in becoming, they are coming to be and ceasing to be. In the something, being is being in itself. Now as self-reference, self-equality, being is no longer immediately, but is self-reference only as the non-being of otherness, as existence reflected into itself. Existent existence. The same goes for non-being. As the moment of something in this unity of being and non-being, it is not non-existence in general, but is the other, and more determinedly, according as being is at the same time distinguished from it, it is reference to its non-existence, being for other. The reference stuff, keep in mind, diagramming is really good for that, keeping in mind the referential aspect. Hence, being in itself is, first, negative reference to non-existence. It has otherness outside it and is opposed to it. Insofar as something is in itself, it is withdrawn from being other and being for other. But second, it has non-being also right in it, for it is itself the non-being of being for other. So that's a simple sideways dialectics, that insofar as being in itself, it is only being in itself because it is not being for other. Being itself seems to be a self-reference, but a self-reference of what? It's the negative self-reference of the non-being of that other non-being. Therefore, it is being for other. It has the structure of otherness hidden within it. But being for other is, first, the negation of the simple reference of being to itself, which in the first place is supposed to be existence and something. Insofar as something is in an other or for an other, it lacks a being of its own. But second, it is not non-existence as pure nothing. It is non-existence that points to being in itself as it's being reflected into itself. Just as conversely, the being in itself points to being for other. 3. Both moments are determinations of one and the same, namely of something. Something is in itself insofar as it has returned from the being for other back to itself. But something is also a determination or circumstance, whether in itself, here the accent is on the in, or in it. Insofar as this circumstance is in it externally, it is a being for other. So here you can kind of see the tangle of a mess that comes about when you try to explain this on the various levels that it can have and does have. It's not necessary, but it is a requirement of thoroughness, although I can tell you, I don't think you can ever actually be fully thorough. Otherwise, you could write a whole book on just the first 3 chapters of this book, like not even accounting for the comments that he makes on the asides. Just laying out all the different relationships that these concepts have to each other and to themselves. It gets crazy. I've tried it. It's fun, but it is, after a certain point, pointless. Once you get the first basic dynamics, you can easily start seeing the other ones, and if you're interested in that, you do it. If not, it's kind of okay. 3. Both moments are determinations of one and the same, namely of something. Something is in itself insofar as it has returned from the being for other back to itself, but something is also a determination or circumstance, whether it's okay. This is that sentence is already advancing something that we haven't gotten to yet, so don't worry about it. This leads to a further determination. Being in itself and being for other are different, but that something also has in it what it is in itself, and conversely is in itself also what it is as being for other. This is the identity of being itself and being for other, in accordance with the determination that the something is itself one and the same something of both moments, and these are in it, therefore undivided. This identity already occurs formally in the sphere of existence, but more explicitly in the treatment of essence, and the latter and later of the relations of interiority and externality, in the most determinate form in the treatment of the idea as a unity of concept and actuality. Opinion has it that with the in itself, something lofty is being said as with the inner. But what something is only in itself is also only in it. In itself is a merely abstract and hence itself external determination. The expressions, there is nothing in it, or there is something in it, imply, though somewhat obscurely, that what is in a thing also pertains to its in itselfness, to its inner true worth. It may be observed that here we have the meaning of the thing in itself. He said the thing, guys. Just letting you know, he said the thing. The Kantian thing. Is a very simple abstraction, though it was for a while a very important determination, something sophisticated, as it were, just as the proposition that we know nothing of what things are in themselves was a much valued piece of wisdom. Things are called in themselves, insofar as abstraction is made from all being for other, which really means, insofar as they are thought without all determination, as nothing. In this sense, of course, it is impossible to know what the thing in itself is, for the question what calls for determinations to be produced. But since the things of which the determinations are called for are at the same time presumed to be things in themselves, which means precisely without determination, the impossibility of an answer is thoughtlessly implanted in the question, or else a senseless answer is given. The thing in itself is the same as that absolute of which nothing is known except that in it all is one. What there is in these things in themselves is therefore very well known. They are as such nothing but empty abstractions void of truth. What, however, the thing in itself in truth is, what there basically is in it, of this the logic is the exposition. But in this logic, something better is understood by the in itself than an abstraction, namely what something is in its concept. But this concept is in itself concrete. As concept, in principle, conceptually graspable, and as determined and as the connected whole of its determinations inherently cognizable. Right, just time for some diagrams. All right, so we have something, and something is already the other of the other. These others are in their mutual non-being, being for other. So, and concretely, it's the being for other, which is being for other to what? Being in itself. These constitute one level of it. Another level to see this from is a bit more interesting. This would be the other, and this would be, it doesn't look like a circle, but okay. This would be the something which is the other to the other. And then this whole relationship of in itself starts making, I think, more sense with this kind of visualization of the relationship of the inner to the outer. And the outer would just be this bound, the infinite bound of the something or the otherness of the other, which contains itself. And therefore you would have this relationship of this, which then encompasses itself. And so the infinity, rather than being, some kind of sideways infinity, is more like this spiral just going inwards of different determinations. And so you can view those things in that way as well. Depending on the day, these make more sense or less sense, depending on what your emphasis is. Yeah. And hopefully that doesn't confuse things more. Let me let me know if it clarifies or confuses. Oh, before that, before moving on, right? So going back to otherness and something, Hegel says, what is in itself is what is in a thing. What is in something, otherness. So what is the in itself, the mysterious in itself? It is the otherness. It is that negative relationship of otherness to otherness. What is the in itself of the being, being in itself? What is in the in itself? The being for other. Why? Because what is underlying the in itselfness is precisely this not being the other of something. That is why it is what is in it. Is that clear? Am I repeating myself too much on that?
No, you're not repeating yourself too much.
All right. So continuing, being in itself has at first the being for other as a moment standing over against it, but positiveness also comes to be positioned over against it. And although in this expression being for other is also included, the expression still contains the determination of the bending back. This is super important. Bending back, self-reference. You should be able to see the connection between these two. A self-reference is what? It's sort of a meaning which bends back, relating to itself. Which already, the determination of the bending back, which has already occurred, of that which is not in itself into that wherein it is positive, and this is its being in itself. Being in itself is normally to be taken as an abstract way of expressing the concept. Positing, strictly speaking, first occurs in the sphere of essence, of objective reflection. The ground posits that which is grounded through it. More strongly, the cause produces an effect, an existence whose subsistence is immediately negated, and which carries the meaning that it has its substance, its being in an other. In the sphere of being, existence only emerges out of becoming, or again, with the something and other is posited, with the finite and infinite. But the finite does not bring forth the infinite, does not posit it. In the sphere of being, the self-determining of the concept is at first only in itself or implicit, and for that reason it is called a transition or passing over. And the reflecting determinations of being, such as something and other or finite and infinite, although they essentially point to one another, or as being for other, also stand on their own qualitatively. The other exists. The finite, like the infinite, is equally to be regarded as an immediate existence that stands firm on its own. The meaning of each appears complete even without its other. The positive and the negative, on the contrary, cause and effect, however much they are taken in isolation, have at the same time no meaning without the other. Their reflective shining in each other, the shine in each of its other, is present right in them. In the different cycles of determination, and especially in the progress of the exposition, or more precisely, in the progress of the concept in the exposition of itself, it is of capital concern always to clearly distinguish what it still is in itself or implicitly, and what is posited, how determinations are in the concept and how they are as posited or as existing for other. This is a distinction that belongs only to the dialectical development and one unknown to metaphysical philosophizing, to which the critical also belongs. The definitions of metaphysics, like its presuppositions, distinctions, and conclusions, are meant to assert and produce only the existent, and that too as existent in itself. People who hate metaphysics, and they're like, Hegel's a metaphysician. Well, here's Hegel hating metaphysics. Don't know what they make of that. One thing to be said about that is that indeed, by any standard account of metaphysics, Hegel is not a metaphysician. And while he hates on metaphysics here, he also states in the introduction, which you probably don't remember anymore. It's just kind of a passing thing, which he says he wants to vindicate and save metaphysics, from its stagnant and forgotten place. But it's not metaphysics as metaphysics anymore. Metaphysics as ontology and as such is what we're doing now, which is what? Logic. So metaphysics in the old style of thinking that you're talking about something other than thought, beyond thought, prior to thought, whatever it is, that metaphysics is indeed, if that's what you mean, it's gone and done. And in that, Kant says he was also critiquing metaphysics, but the same thing Kant was doing was also along the lines of that metaphysics. So if Hegel remains a metaphysician, it is only in a very, very new sense, in which to be a metaphysician is to be a thinker of the true in itself, which is not an indeterminate thing in itself, which has no relationships, but it actually is a thing in itself, full of relationships, full of its own internal otherness, to which it refers itself to no other but itself, which also happens to be the nature of reasoning and meaning. So in the unity of the something with itself, being for other is identical with its in itself. The being for other is thus in the something. The determinateness thus reflected into itself is therefore again a simple existent, and again a quality determination. So yet again, back to the diagram. So we have been delving into the nature of something. We have in it now being for other, being being in itself. These are in their own little circular dialectic. And this totality is now determination. Oh well. And just as being for other and being itself could be seen as something being run through the other and the other run through something, being for determination and its correlate constitution will now do the exact same play, in which determination is going to be being for other run through being itself, and constitution is to be being itself run through being for other. Because he mentions here, he says, in the unity of something with itself, being for other is identical with its in itself. Being for other is thus in the something, because what is in the being itself makes it exist and stand out. It's being for other. And what is it going to be in the being for other, or the otherness to this being for other, which makes it other? It's going to be its own being in itself, because in its being for other, to a being for other, it remains within itself, which is I just said it. It remains within itself, so therefore it is being in itself, and it falls right back. So, any questions on that section of something other being itself, being for other? Is that mostly clear? 731. Questions on that? Comments?
Doing good.
Clear as mud. Come on, Decause. If you got questions, Decause, ask them. You got me here. You won't always have me, like Jesus said. You will always have the ignorant and unknowledgeable, unthinking commenters on Hegel. They will be there forever, but you won't always have me. Because being honest, this section is one of the clearest in this book. If this does not make sense, so much as keeps getting harder. Although I don't think it gets much harder. Like if the whole reality negation thing is probably one of the hardest moves. Beyond that, it remains harder, but in different ways. And there's many ways in which later stuff actually gets much easier, but in different ways. Like the stuff on essence, for example, a lot of people consider that much easier than the first book, simply because it's a lot more concrete. People are more used to thinking essential relationships, even though they don't realize it, and nobody else ever mentions this, because Hegel's the only one who structures things this way, as far as I know. But once you get there, you're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And even though we do think in these relationships of being constantly, they're not relationships that we're using consciously most of the time. Are you saying anything, Rain?
No, my thing just does that sometimes.
Yeah, okay, that's just fine. All right, let's move on. Racing through. Oh yeah, I love this section. It caused me much suffering when I first read it, mostly because I was overcomplicating it. A lot of this is quite simple, and people overcomplicate it too. I know that from experience. So determination, constitution, and limit. The in itself, in which the something is reflected into itself from its being for other, no longer is an abstract in itself, but as a negation of its being for other is mediated through this latter, which is thus its moment. It is not only the immediate identity of the something with itself, but the identity by virtue of which the something also has present in it what it is in itself. The being for other is present in it because the in itself is the sublation of it. It is in itself from it. But because it is still abstract and therefore essentially affected with negation, it is equally affected with being for other. We have here not only quality in reality, existent determinateness, but determinateness existent in itself, and the development consists in positing such determinateness as thus immanently reflected. So, this is again time for just a quick diagram. Saying something is total bound. Within it, we have something is already existence. We have reality, or we have the other. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which way you put it. We have negation, and now we have reality is quality or determinacy, and Hegel says it's determinacy existent within itself. So now we're going one more level. We're going one level in, 2 levels in. So you can totally view it that way makes perfectly good sense. So, existent, you could also frame this as how did it, I used to love play this language game of like trying to say it with one term, like oh god, I can't remember what the hell I used to say. There's determinacy, and there's a certain third level you can kind of grammatically say it, and existent. You could say like existence. For the triple level. Existence. It looks more like a T. Another existence. And yet another existence. So, existence. It's like, repeating things like the being of being, or the being of being, the nothing. You can do it so many ways. I think trying to do that and try to think about that helps you develop your cognition for this kind of thing, because it really does work in that sort of self-referential way. And structurally, like you can tell already, there is actually a form that is happening, but it's not a form that you can understand just by seeing the form. Because while looking at that formal process, I think helps when you're brand new, and even when you're not so new, helps you situate like where you are in an argument and what might be formally happening in an argument, which will sometimes really clarify the operative meaning in that argument. Relying on that form too much is going to sometimes lead you to think that you grasped something when you actually haven't grasped it. That's happened to me. Because the form is true, it's just you're not really grasping the meat of it. It's a bone. So on the quality, which in the simple something is in itself essentially in unity with with a something's other moment, its being in it can be named its determination, provided that this word is distinguished in a more precise signification from determinateness in general. Determination is affirmative determinateness. It is the in itself by which a something abides in its existence while involved with an other that would determine it, by which it preserves itself in its self-equality, holding on to it in its being for other. Something fulfills its determination to the extent that the further determinateness, which variously accrues to it in the measure of its being itself as it relates to an other, becomes its feeling. Determination implies that what something is in itself is also present in it. Actually, this footnote of the prior page is important. Determination is, in German, Bestimmung. Bestimmung also carries the meaning of vocation or destiny, as in Die Bestimmung des Menschen, the vocation of humankind, which is a work by Fichte, which is, I think, pretty good. So in this sense, it's like saying, when people say, "Oh, I am determined to do this. I'm determined to be that." What is that? It's the internal affirmative determinacy. The quality within oneself, that one is defining oneself through and against the external other, and keeping oneself as oneself against this otherness. There is I actually love the way that this works both in German and in English, because it has the regular way we speak about determination in the sense of, I'm determined to do this or that or be this or that, is precisely in line with the fundamental meaning of this concept. The determination of the human being, its vocation, is rational thought. Thinking in general is his simple determinateness. By it, the human being is distinguished from the brute. He is thinking in himself, insofar as his thinking is distinguished also from his being for other, from his own natural and sensuous being that brings him an immediate association with the other. But thinking is also in him. The human being is himself thinking. He exists as thinking. Thought is his concrete existence and actuality. And further, since thinking is in his existence, and existence is in his thinking is concrete, must be taken as having content and feeling. It is rational thought, and as such, the determination of the human being. But even this determination is again only in itself, as an ought. That is to say, it is together with the feeling embodied in itself, in the form of an in itself in general, as against the existence which is not embodied in it, but still lies outside it, confronting it, immediate sensibility and nature. I think that's a pretty good example, but I myself had trouble with that when I first read it the first couple times. I don't know if it's clear to you all, if it makes sense, or anybody find that confusing? Because if you look at that, it's following the same kind of diagram I was talking about. He says thinking in general. Darn this thing! Oh, there you go. Thinking in general is his simple determinants. By it, the human being is distinguished from the brute. It's the through non-being of the brute, the human being is thinking. Then he is thinking in himself, insofar as his thinking is distinguished also from his being for other, from his own natural and sensuous being that brings him an immediate association with the other. That being for other is here linked to natural being, as opposed to thinking. This is actually an interesting thing. This already preempts and is projecting forward something that is developed much later in the system with spirit. What is nature? Nature is self-externality. So what you like by this kind of analogy, like this structure, it should be obvious to you that then, if nature is self-externality and the movement of logics is through self-referential negation, then self-externality, when it's self-external, when externality is external to itself, it is just like the logic of the other, in which if it is externality, or rather, it's a mouthful, if outsidedness is outside of itself, then it is outside of itself, which is inside itself as a concept, therefore it is in itself. So the mind or thinking is outsidedness, which refers to itself, which therefore is in itself. So the structure holds. But thinking is also in him. The human being is himself thinking. He exists as thinking. Thought is his concrete existence and actuality. And further, since thinking is in his existence, and his existence is in his thinking. Thinking is concrete, must be taken as having content and feeling. It is rational thought, and such the determination of the human being. And so we have determinateness, being itself. Thought is the determinateness of the human being. Thinking is the being itself. But then thinking is not just the being itself, because thinking is how the human being is human within himself and for themselves. Because our thinking isn't just in our heads, it is us. We are what is in that thinking. We are the subjective process of thinking or cognition itself. And I think this is a profound thing. It's a thing with Kant. This is what Kant gets at with the transcendental unity of apperception. there's a lecture I once listened to, and I try to look for the passage, and I guess, or at least in English, I'm not finding a passage that has the exact same wording, in which they say that the great discovery of the transcendental unity of apperception is not that, oh, well, everything's unified with the mind. No, apparently Kant is more radical than that. The great meaning of that is being is and appears in thought, in thinking. Thinking is the transcendental unity of not just perceptions, but of the understanding of reason. Well, thinking is, in this case, reason. But all the contents of the mind, both thought and sense. So thought itself, reason itself, is what is unifying and what is bringing about the manifold in the first place. That I think is really fascinating. So I think determination should be clear. 2, the feeling of the being itself, determinateness, is also distinct from the determinateness which is only being for other and remains outside the determination. For in this field qualitative, the distinguished terms are left in their sublated being, also with an immediate qualitative being contrasting them. That which is something has in it thus separates itself and is from this side the external existence of the something and also its existence, but not as belonging to its being in itself. Determinateness is thus constitution. One way to prove this is, so here's where the what I would call lateral representation of concepts is more helpful than a well, actually probably is equally as helpful. So we have something, we have determination in it, and then insofar as this and this, this total white space would be representing it. Insofar as we have that relationship, it's a negative relationship. What is in is not what is out here. So the inner, or the determination, is only determination insofar as it is determinate through this non-being of this outer something, or the bound of something, or the containing something, whatever you want to call it. This relationship is, therefore, the relationship of determination. That this determination is, not determination, constitution. So this mutual non-being, or this outsidedness, which isn't the right word, but it suffices to get the point across. Constitution. So insofar as we have this negative relationship, that is constitution, between determination. Or you could also think about this way, that you have determination and just like everything else, if determination is, then it exists. And if it exists, then it has another beside it. And we already have the logic of the other, which is what? That the other is also a something. So determination is in relationship to a determination. But this is a negative relationship, and therefore determination is only through this negative relationship, and this total relationship is, that's horrible. This total relationship is what constitution is. Just to so that's another way to visualize that movement. We're all good on that? Yes, makes sense. And then likewise, the same thing, like literally all of this is a repetition of something and other. Or really, if you want to pull it back even more, it's all the repetition of reality and negation. The exact same thing keeps happening. This chapter is like a hall of mirrors. The same image is just happening inwards over and over again at a different level. Cognitively, they are different insofar as we are aware of the different levels of the reflection that's going on. But at every moment, the reflection is happening basically in the same fashion. It's not indifferent, but it's a very minor difference of just like keeping track of the layers. That's about it. Likewise, how do we get back from, we've already seen how we get from determination to the Constitution. How do we go back to determination from the Constitution? Well, the Constitution is itself constituted, therefore it's self-relating, therefore it is in itself. What is in a thing is its determination, therefore, boom, determination. Constitution is determination, determination is Constitution. Same thing. Constituted in this or that way, thus something is caught up in external influences and in external relationships. This external connection in which the constitution depends and the being determined through another appear as something accidental, but it is the quality of something to be given over to its externality and to have a constitution. Insofar as something alters, the alteration falls on the side of its constitution. The latter is that in the something which becomes an other. The something itself preserves itself in the alteration. The latter affects only this unstable surface of the something's otherness, not its determination. Determination and constitution are thus distinct from each other. Something according to its determination is indifferent to its constitution, but that which the something has in it is the middle term of this syllogism connecting the two, determination and constitution. Or rather, the being in the something showed itself to fall apart into these two extremes. The simple middle term is determinateness as such. Its identity belongs to determination just as well as to constitution, but determination passes over into constitution on its own, and constitution into determination. This is implied in what has been said. The connection, upon closer consideration, is this: insofar as that which something is in itself is also in it, thus something is affected with being for other. Determination is therefore open as such to the relation with the other. Determinateness is at the same time moment. Ooh, that is I don't know if he had said this yet. In case he hasn't, here you go. This is what the definition or the meaning of moments is. Things are moments insofar as they are determinate. They are determinate insofar as they are distinguished through a non-being, which also recurs that we have developed through determinateness, all the way from something to other, determination, constitution, everything, all of that. Therefore, a moment is at its most simplistic a determinateness. Like, if you want to make an identity between that, same thing. Ideality at the beginning or at the end of chapter 1, if you remember, is also defined this way. Ideality, moment, determinateness end up sharing very similar, if not one dare say, the exact same concept form, used merely as different forms of that cognition for different emphasis. So determinateness is at the same time moment, but it contains at the same time the qualitative distinction of being different from being in itself, of being the negative, the something, another existence. This determinateness, which thus holds the other in itself, united with the being in itself, introduces otherness in the latter, or in determination, and determination is thereby reduced to constitution. Conversely, the being for other, isolated as constitution and posited on its own, is in the same as what the other as such is, the other in it, that is, the other of itself. But it consequently is self-referring existence, thus being in itself with a determinateness, therefore determination. Consequently, as much as the two are also to be held apart, constitution, which appears to be grounded in something external in an other in general, also depends on determination. And the determining from outside is at the same time determined by the something's own immanent determination. And further, constitution belongs to that which something is in itself. Something alters along with its constitution. And if you remember, altering is an internal becoming, a result becoming. So the moment of altering, or altering as concept, or as determinate concept in a way, is co-determinate with constitution here, in which, insofar as we consider things under the constitution, we consider them in their altering. Once we have settled from constitution to determination, we're no longer considering an altering, we're considering a self-related reflection. A settled self-related reflection and not a shifting one, like something is a settled reflection of otherness. Insofar as the other is still shifting, but once it is settled as the other of the other, we are no longer altering. This altering of something is no longer the first alteration of something merely in accordance with its being for other. The first was an alteration only implicitly present, one that belonged to the inner concept. Now the alteration is posited in the something. The something itself is further determined, and negation is posited as immanent to it, as its developed being in itself. The transition of determination and constitution into each other is at first the sublation of their distinction, and existence or something in general is thereby posited. Moreover, since this something in general results from a distinction that also includes qualitative otherness within it, there are two somethings, but these are with respect to each other, not just others in general, so that this negation would still be abstract and would occur only in the comparison of the two. Rather, the negation is immanent to the somethings as existing. They are indifferent to each other, but this, their affirmation, is no longer immediate. Each refers itself to itself through the intermediary of the sublation of the otherness, which in determination is reflected into the in itselfness. All right, so this is starting to go hard and fast. Let me see if diagram this will help. So the transition of determination and constitution to each other is at first the sublation of their distinction, and existence or something in general is thereby posited. So, all right, that totality brings us back to something, but of course this is something at a yet further higher level. Moreover, since the something in general results from a distinction that also includes qualitative otherness within it, there are two somethings. So, we can take that something to itself be, or we can look at the determination and constitution as themselves somethings within the something. But these are with respect to each other, not just others in general, so that this negation would also be abstract and would occur only in the comparison of the two, immanent to the somethings. So, then the somethings themselves don't just remain the mere somethings or mere others, like the logic recurs and they get distinguished within themselves as well. They are also determinate, but then they are determinate in relationship to each other, in that the something is the other of the other. These two mutual others within something constitute each other and also determine each other. Each refers itself to itself through the intermediary. Through the intermediary, the sublation of the otherness, which in determination is reflected into the in itselfness. So, in mutually being for other, they bounce back to each other as in themselves, and therefore determine themselves through that explicit being in itself, through not being the other. Something behaves in this way in relation to the other through itself, since otherness is posited in it as its own moment. It's in itselfness, whole negation in itself, and it now has its affirmative existence through its intermediary alone. So, whereas with the other of the other, it seems that being for other was the dominant mode. Here we've shifted into a sort of a dominant determination, well, literally being the determination of being itself. And now the affirmative existence through its intermediary alone. But the other is also qualitatively distinguished from this affirmative existence, since it's posited outside the something. The negation of its other is only the quality of the something, for it is in the sublation of its other that it is something. So the quality here is, the negation is the quality of it. The other, for its part, truly confronts an existence only with this sublation. It confronts the first something only externally, or since the two are in fact inherently joined together, that is, according to their concept, their connectedness consists in this, that existence has passed over into otherness, something into other, that something is just as much an other as the other is. So we have a far more concrete account of how something and other move towards each other, or move into each other, fall into each other. Now, insofar as the in itself is the non-being of the otherness that is contained in it, but is at the same time also distinct as existent, something itself, negation, the ceasing to be of an other in it. It is posited as behaving negatively in relation to the other, and in so doing preserving itself. This other, the selfness of the something, is negation of the negation, is something's being in itself, and the sublation is a simple negation at the same time in it, namely as its negation of the other something external to it. It is one determinateness of the two somethings that, on the one hand, as negation of negation, is identical with the in itselfness of the somethings, and also on the other hand, since these negations are to each other as other somethings, joins them together of their own accord, and since each negation negates the other, equally separates them. This determinateness is limit. And I don't think he had to make that giant restatement and summary of this whole movement, but for those who need it, there it is. Although I think he says it in a way in which at certain moments it gets more confusing than it should be. At the basic level, limit is precisely that moment in which determination is brought back through constitution. That's one way you could see it. That limit is this point at which determination is brought back to constitution. Except it also isn't. It's just like existence, where existence technically does not accent neither being nor nothing. Limit does not accent really a side of determination or a side of constitution. We can look at it validly in both ways, and when we use it in common language, in the ways that we imply things, it literally does function in both ways. It functions both under an aspect of positive determinacy, and positive determination as also just a negative constitution. 3. Being for other is indeterminate, affirmative association of something with its other. In limit, the non-being for other is emphasized, the qualitative negation of the other, which is thereby kept out of the something that is reflected into itself. We must see the development of this concept. A development will rather look like confusion and contradiction. I don't know why he says this here now, as if this hasn't already been entirely confusing and contradicting. Contradiction immediately raises its head because limit, as an internally reflected negation of something, ideally holds in it the moments of something and other, and these, as distinct moments, are at the same time posited in the sphere of existence as really qualitatively distinct. So, I mean, we've developed a bunch of dialectics all the way from chapter 1 to here, chapter 2. Contradiction maybe is not yet like clearly expressed in an explicit conceptual term so far, but if you followed this far and you've tried to do this in your mind as we're going along and thinking about the meaning, you should already start having an intuitive sense of what contradiction, ideality, moments, all these other things are. well, ideality and moments are being defined, but contradiction, you should start having an intuition of what contradiction is in the kinds of things that we've produced, as well as how contradiction really happens and why it happens. So alpha, something is therefore immediate, self-referring existence, and at first it has a limit with respect to one other. Limit is the non-being of the other, not of the something itself. In limit, something marks the boundary of its other. But other is itself a something in general. The limit that something has with respect to an other is therefore also the limit of the other as a something. It is the limit of this something in virtue of which the something holds the first something as its other away from itself, or is a non-being of that something. The limit is thus not only the non-being of the other, but of the one something just as the other, and consequently of the something in general. So let me see if I can draw something to relate to that. So we have something in general. We have something, which is also a something, everything, two things that are something for themselves, but other to the others, or other in relation. And this one's a bit harder in that just this distinction between the two, just having that difference in which these can appear as something at all is telling. Because if you get rid of this boundary, here's another way to see this, probably even better. This inner is a something. Surrounded by the otherness. But it also is something. And then this boundary is a limit. If this boundary did not keep things distinct between the inner and the outer, or the something and the other, or the something and the something, then this whole thing would just be one indeterminate blank. The somethings could not appear. You need the limit. Without the limit, without this line, this bounding thing, which is both the non-being of this as well as the non-being of this, it is the mutual non-being, but it's also the mutual bound of the being in itself. Because this whole area is in itself, and this whole area is in itself. And it is in itself through this line. If you get rid of that line, nothing remains. There is nothing to be in to begin with. Something in general. But the limit is equally, essentially, the non-being of the other. Thus, through its limit, something at the same time is. In limiting, something is, of course, thereby reduced to being limited itself. But as the seizing of the other in it, its limit is at the same time itself only the being of the something. The something is what it is by virtue of it, has its quality in it. This relation of the external appearance of the fact that limit is simple negation of the first negation, whereas the other is at the same time the negation of negation, the in itselfness of the something. Seeing that image of the black background and white circle, that bounding line, where black and white meet, that itself is, one could say, the other, and then the black itself is the other of that other, and then the white itself is also the other of that bounding line, which contains both, and is also not both. Something as an immediate existence is therefore the limit with respect to another something, but it has this limit in it, and it's something through the mediation of that limit, which is just as much its non-being. The limit is the mediation in virtue of which something and other each both is and is not. Beta, now insofar as something in its limit both is and is not, and these moments are an immediate qualitative distinction, the non-existence and the existence of the something fall outside each other. Something has its existence outside its limit, or as representation would have it, inside it. In the same way, the other two, since it is something, has it outside it. The limit is the middle point between the two at which they leave off. They have existence beyond each other, beyond their limit. The limit, as the non-being of each, is the other of both. It is in accordance with this difference of the something from its limit that the line appears as line outside its limit, the point, the plane as plane outside the limit, the line, the solid as solid only outside its limiting plane. This is the aspect of limit that first occurs to figurative representation, the self-external being of the concept, and is also most commonly assumed in the context of spatial objects. So I love this example. When I first read it, I had no idea what the fuck he was talking about, and then I thought about it years later in the philosophy of nature, and just made perfect sense. You know, the points are the limits of the line. You know, the line is both, one could say, within the bounds sketched by the points, or you could say also outside the bounds of the points. Then the plane is obviously outside the bounds set by lines. And then, of course, you have volumes, in which you have planes outside the bounds of planes, or you have volume outside the bounds of planes. So, you know, it's just an outsidedness, which is playing within or outside the bounds of its limit. Both ways work. See it. Oh, he left. To do non-being of the other. Gamma, but further, something as it is outside the limit, as the unlimited something, is only existence in general. So, you know, we here it's talking about as if we erase the limit, you know, outside the limit, as if there was no limit. Something is not determinate, it is only existence in general. We return back to the mere being, which at the same time is not. As such, it is not distinguished from its other, it only exists, and therefore it and its other have the same determinations. Each is only something in general, or each is other, and so both are the same. But the first immediate existence, is now posited in them as limit. In it both are what they are, distinct from each other, but it is also equally their common distinguishedness, the unity and distinguishedness of both, just like existence. This double identity of the two, existence and limit, contains this, that something existence only in limit, and that since limit and immediate existence are each at the same time the negative of each other, the something which is now only in its limit equally separates itself from itself, points beyond itself to its non-being, and declares it to be its being, and so it passes over into it. To apply this to the preceding example, the one determination is this, that something is what it is only in its limit. Therefore, the point is the limit of the line, not because the latter just ceases at the point and has existed outside it. The line is the limit of the plane, not because the plane just ceases at it. And the same goes for the plane as the limit of solid. Rather, at the point the line also begins. The point is its absolute beginning, and if the line is represented as unlimited on both its sides, its two sides, or as is said, as extended to infinity, the point still constitutes its element, just as the line constitutes the element of the plane and the plane that of the solid. These limits are the principle of that which they delimit, just as one, for instance, is as hundredth the limit, but also the element of the whole hundred. The other determination is the unrest of the something in its limit in which it is immanent, the contradiction that propels it beyond itself. Thus the point is this dialectic of itself becoming line, the line, the dialectic of becoming plane, the plane of becoming total space. A second definition is given of line, plane, and whole space, which has the line come to be through the movement of the point, the plane through the movement of the line, and so forth. This movement of the point, the line, and so forth is however viewed as something accidental, or as movement only in figurative representation. In fact, however, this view is taken back by supposing that the determination from which the line and so forth originate are their elements and principles, and these are at the same time nothing else but their limits. The coming to be is not considered as accidental or only as represented, that the point, the line, the plane as per se in itself, or as such, self-contradictory beginnings which on their own repel themselves from themselves, and consequently that the point passes over from itself into the line through its concept, moves in itself, and makes the line come to be, and so on. All this lies in the concept of the limit which is immanent in the something. The application itself, however, belongs to the treatment of space. As an indication of it here, we can say that the point is the totally abstract limit, but in a determinate existence. This existence is still taken in total abstraction. It is the so-called absolute, that is, abstract space, the absolutely continuous being outside one another. Inasmuch as a limit is not abstract negation, but is rather in this existence, inasmuch as it is spatial determinateness, the point is spatial, is the contradiction of abstract negation and continuity, and is for that reason the transition as it occurs and has already occurred into the line, and so forth. And so there is no point, just as there is no line or plane. Thus something, posited with its immanent limit, contradiction of itself, by virtue of which it is directed and driven out and beyond itself, is the finite. Okay. We have made it thus far. Back again, just to reiterate on limit. That bounding distinction is what limit is. Without it, we have nothing at all. We're right back to being a nothing, or rather, since we immediately was being a nothing, we also have existence. We're right back to existence. So there is no escaping limit. There is no way like, oh, what if we could think about things, beyond limits? And Hegel's saying, you're stupid. No, you can't think things beyond limits. Limits are the very distinctions of things themselves. If you think things, you're thinking things within limits. Otherwise, you're not thinking at all. There's also a sense in which, obviously, this which is inside and this which is outside is likewise a limit to the limit, which is also going to come about. Hegel's actually going to mention it in the beginnings of this next section on finitude. The thing about points, because that seems important. I should probably emphasize that more. He says, the other determination is the unrest of the something in its limit in which it is immanent, the contradiction that propels it beyond itself. Let me see. Okay, the other determination is the unrest of the something in its limit. So, the something in its limit, either in this or in this, is the unrest. And actually, yeah, this works out. So this is something as well. And then these exist through that limit. I think the point about the point kind of sketches this out if this hasn't already been clear. Since with the logic, we're always dealing not only in the logic, but in every other work by Hegel, at every point that you treat it as the absolute. If the point is absolute, if space is the point, one, that's a contradiction because space is self-outsidedness. If there is nothing outside the point is not a spatial determination. It cannot be. Therefore, it fails to be spatial. So we don't have space at all by that very standard. Since the point is spatial, it's got to be outside of itself. Therefore, it has to be another point. But in order for this point to be outside the other point, that's not a happy face, but in order for that point to be outside the other point, it's through the line. The point is outside itself through the line. The point can oppose itself as point through the line. The way in which the point can contradict or oppose itself is through the line. Likewise, the line can only oppose or exist or contradict itself through the plane. And likewise, the plane can only oppose or contradict itself through the volume. Likewise, something opposes itself to something through the limit. So the other determination is the unrest of something in its limit, in which is immanent the contradiction that propels itself beyond. So something in being something, because it exists, opposes itself to another. The other is also a something. Something opposes something, or the other opposes the other. This is, in regular, formal logic, a contradiction. You're saying that A is not A. Literally, you're saying that something somehow is not something. How is that possible? Well, through the limit. You're saying that something somehow is not, or the other is somehow not the other. How is that possible? Through something. This is one of the forms in which you can pay attention to how contradiction is arising and what contradiction really is. Hegel actually phrases this in the phenomenology, and he says the proper way to to put contraries like being and nothing or black and white. Yes, these are contraries, but it misses the point because these are determinate contraries already loaded with sensuous meaning, in which they are given to us as if they just are different. And when it's pointed out that the logic of it is not quite that there's something deeper to it, it still doesn't make sense because we're still thinking about it in this given differentiation. But all contradiction is essentially the failure to self-identify whether you are different or whether you are self-identical. If you're self-identical, it's only because you're different to yourself. If you have determination, it's only because you're constituted. And if you're constituted, it's only because you have determination. At any single point in a dialectic, there is a failure to self-identify and also a failure to be different. The only way that is resolved is literally in accepting that contradiction, which, yes, it is self-identical, it is self-different. That is what it is. And if we understand the way that it's working, if we understand the movements of meaning, this makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense how something is also not something precisely through the limit. It also makes sense how the point is not a point precisely through the line, and all this other jazz. That's something that ought to be made sense of, and one has to be very careful with. And I think this is a good place to leave it to begin next time, and we should be able to finish finitude through infinity and at the beginning of chapter 3.